poured myself a second cup of coffee that morning and stood by the kitchen window watching the maple in the backyard. The leaves had already gone mostly gold. It was that particular October light we get in Ontario, the kind that makes everything look like it's on fire and grieving at the same time. My daughter called it beautiful. I always thought it looked like something ending. My daughter was getting married in 4 days. I should have been happy. I was happy, mostly. 43 years I'd raised that girl on my own after her father walked out, and she'd turned into someone who made me proud every single day. Worked her way through rehearsal. Became a physiotherapist. Bought her own condo in Hamilton before she was 30. She didn't need saving. She never did. His name was Garrett. She'd met him 2 years earlier at a colleague's birthday party. He was tall, well-spoken, worked in commercial real estate downtown Toronto. When she brought him home the first time, I made shepherd's pie and tried not to stare too much. He was charming, a little polished, the way some men are when they've been told their whole lives that they're impressive. But he looked at my daughter like she was the only person in the room, and that counted for something. His mother was a different matter. Her name was Vivienne. Not Vivian. She corrected me on that the first time we met at a dinner at their house in Oakville. Big house. The kind with a double garage and a front entryway that echoes when you walk in. She had the kind of handshake that's firm in a way that's meant to establish something. She wore a blazer to a family dinner on a Sunday. I wore a cardigan I'd had since 2009 and felt every year of it. She was pleasant enough on the surface. Ask about my work. I'd spent 31 years as an administrative coordinator for a school board, just retired the previous spring. She nodded when I told her. The kind of nod that doesn't mean anything. The kind that means the topic has been acknowledged and filed away as not particularly interesting. She talked about her husband's consulting firm, about their place in Muskoka, about Garrett's brother who was doing his MBA at Queen's. I drove home that night on the 403 and told myself I was being too sensitive. That not everyone warms up quickly. That I'd give her time. I gave her time. 8 months of it, across 4 dinners and 1 very long Canada Day weekend at the Muskoka cottage where I slept in a room with a pull-out sofa and listened to the loons at night and tried to feel grateful for the invitation. She was never cruel. That's the thing about women like Vivienne. They don't shout. They don't say anything you can point to directly and call wrong. It's more like a slight atmospheric pressure, a temperature in the room that drops 2 degrees when certain subjects come up. She asked once at the cottage whether my daughter had considered looking at venues in Toronto for the wedding rather than the Ancaster Mill she'd chosen. "It's a lovely spot," Vivienne said, "just a little. Tucked away, isn't it?" My daughter said she loved it there. Vivienne smiled and said, "Of course you do." That was the tone of things. I told myself it didn't matter. My daughter was happy. The wedding was going to be beautiful. I had a new dress. Sage green. Bought it at a boutique in Burlington that my friend Carol dragged me to, and I felt genuinely good in it. I was going to stand up there and watch my daughter marry a man who loved her, and I was going to cry happy tears, and that was going to be the story of that day. And then came the rehearsal dinner. It was held at a private room at a restaurant in Oakville, the kind of place where the menu doesn't have prices, and they bring you an amuse-bouche you didn't ask for. About 30 people. Both families, some close friends. My daughter sat at the center looking radiant and slightly overwhelmed. Garrett held her hand under the table. Vivienne had arranged the seating. I was at the far end of the table, between Garrett's uncle, a quiet man who spent most of the evening on his phone, and someone introduced to me as a family friend whose name I immediately lost. It wasn't the worst seat in the room. But my daughter was 7 chairs away, and I noticed. The food was excellent. The wine was better. I made small talk and watched my daughter laugh and felt mostly fine. Then Vivienne stood up to give a toast. She was good at it. I'll give her that. She spoke about Garrett's childhood, about how they'd always known he'd find someone remarkable. She talked about first meeting my daughter, about being charmed by her warmth and her work ethic. She said all the right things. People smiled. People nodded. And then she said this. "We know that Miriam comes from a more modest background than what Garrett is used to." She paused and smiled, the smile of someone who thinks they're being gracious, and we think that's actually wonderful. She's worked so hard to build herself up. That kind of determination is something we truly admire. We're so pleased to welcome her into our family and, well, another pause. Give her a chance to experience a different kind of life. There was a little ripple of laughter. Some people probably thought it was a compliment. The way she'd arranged the words, it almost sounded like one. I looked at my daughter. The smile on her face had gone somewhere else. It was still there, technically. The muscles were still arranged correctly. But behind her eyes, something had gone very still. She was looking at the centerpiece. Garrett had his hand on her back and he was looking at his mother with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not angry enough, in my opinion, but that's a separate conversation. I felt a heat start in my chest that I recognized from the years when I'd had to sit in rooms where people underestimated me and couldn't afford to say so. The specific, particular heat of swallowing something that deserves to be said out loud. I looked at my wine glass. I looked at my daughter. I looked back at Vivian, who was accepting compliments on her toast with the serene air of someone who had planned this, who had weighed the words, who had decided that a rehearsal dinner surrounded by witnesses was the right time to establish the hierarchy for the next 30 years of family gatherings. Have you ever been in a room where someone tried to make you feel small? Not just you, but someone you would throw yourself in front of a car for? I sat with that feeling for about 90 seconds. Then I stood up. I don't think anyone expected it. I didn't have a prepared speech. I hadn't planned this. I was 63 years old. I was wearing a wrap dress from Reitman's, and my hands were steady in a way that surprised me. I'd like to say a few words, if that's all right, I said. I didn't make it a question, exactly. I thanked Vivienne for the dinner and meant exactly none of it. I talked about my daughter, about the real version of her, the one Vivienne's little speech had reduced to a before and after story, a project. I talked about my daughter at 8 years old doing her homework at our kitchen table in our apartment on Barton Street, while I worked a second shift at a grocery store to make sure the lights stayed on. About my daughter at 16 tutoring kids for free at the public library because she said it was only fair, people had helped her too. About my daughter at 28 calling me from her new condo, crying happy tears because she'd done it. She'd really done it, entirely on her own. She doesn't need a chance to experience a different kind of life, I said, and I kept my voice even because she's already built a remarkable one, and anyone who sees her background as something she needs to be lifted out of, with respect, hasn't been paying attention. Very quiet in the room. What I hope for her, I continued, is a family that sees her clearly. That's all any of us deserves. I sat down. My daughter was looking at me with an expression I will keep inside me for the rest of my life. She mouthed something. I'm fairly sure it was thank you. Garrett's uncle, the quiet man beside me, leaned over and said very softly, well done. I picked up my wine and drank some of it. Vivienne had a smile fixed to her face that didn't reach anything above her jaw. Her husband, a man I'd spoken to maybe 40 words with over 8 months, was looking at the tablecloth. The family friend, whose name I'd forgotten, was suddenly very interested in her bread roll. The dinner continued. The food kept coming. Someone put on a safer topic about the weather forecast for the wedding day. My daughter came around to my end of the table before dessert and hugged me from behind and didn't say anything, just held on for a moment, and I pressed her hand and that was enough. But that wasn't the end of it. 2 days later, the day before the wedding, my daughter called me in the evening. Her voice was different. Tight. She told me she'd been at the venue doing a final walkthrough and she'd stopped by her future in-laws' house afterward to drop off some table card holders Vivienne had asked for. She'd arrived a few minutes earlier than expected. She'd let herself in through the back gate. She'd been there enough times to do that, and she'd heard voices on the back deck. Vivienne was on the phone. My daughter hadn't meant to listen, but she stopped because she heard her own name. What she heard was her future mother-in-law describing her. My daughter, Miriam, who had worked herself to the bone and never once asked anyone for anything she hadn't earned, as a charity project and not really our kind. Vivienne said she hoped Garrett would come to his senses, that there were still options. The wedding was in 22 hours. My daughter called me from the driveway because she'd walked back out through the gate without knocking and she didn't know what to do. I knew what to do. I'd known for 8 months, actually. I'd just been waiting to see if it would become necessary. Here's the thing about working 31 years in school board administration. You deal with a lot of paperwork. You develop a memory for procedure, for policy, for what's documented and what isn't and why that matters. And when Vivienne's husband's consulting firm had come up repeatedly over dinners, I'd listened more carefully than she knew. I won't go into all of it here. Some of it isn't mine to share, and some of it is still being sorted out legally. But I will tell you that over the previous several months, I had come to understand, through a source I'd rather not name, but who trusted me enough to speak plainly, that Vivienne's husband's firm had not conducted itself entirely above board in a number of its municipal contracts. Contracts in this region, projects that involved public money. There was documentation, not rumor, not impression. Documentation. My source had been sitting on it, not knowing what to do with it. I had a contact at a regional newspaper through my years at the school board, someone I'd worked with on communications during a messy labor dispute back in 2014. I'd never called in any kind of favor from her. I called her that evening. I also called my daughter's future father-in-law. I told him, very calmly I think, very clearly, what my daughter had heard on the deck. I told him that I had found the last 8 months instructive, and I told him that I had spent the previous evening speaking with a journalist who was already aware of certain things and was prepared to move forward regardless, but that I had suggested she hold off until after the weekend, out of respect for the young people getting married. I told him I thought it would be worth having a family conversation before the ceremony. He was quiet for a long time. "What do you want?" he asked finally. I told him I didn't want anything complicated. I wanted my daughter to walk down the aisle tomorrow without wondering whether the woman standing up there with a fixed smile had just been on the phone calling her a charity project. I wanted a real apology, not a performance, not another carefully arranged speech. A real one, delivered privately, woman to woman before she put on her wedding dress. And I wanted to know that the next 30 years of Sunday dinners and holidays and grandchildren, God willing, would not be conducted at 2 degrees below freezing. That was all. He called back 40 minutes later. He said Vivienne would call my daughter in the morning. She did. I don't know everything that was said. My daughter told me it was real, that it was different from everything before it, that Vivienne had cried, which apparently she does not do easily. My daughter said she believed her. I wasn't sure I did entirely, but that was my daughter's call to make and not mine. The wedding was on a Saturday. The Ancaster Mill in October. The river running dark gold outside the windows. My daughter in ivory with her grandmother's earrings. Garrett crying before she'd even made it halfway down the aisle. I sat in the front row and held Carol's hand and let myself cry without worrying about the mascara. Vivienne was seated across the aisle. At one point during the reception, she came to find me, and we stood together near the window by the water for a moment. She didn't say much. She said she'd had time to think. She said she could see that she'd been... She paused on the word for a while. Small. She said she was sorry. I thanked her. I meant more of it than I'd expected. The newspaper story ran 6 weeks later. Her husband had already engaged a lawyer. The firm went through a lengthy review by the provincial auditor. It was not a small thing. I felt a complicated set of feelings about it. Not satisfaction, exactly. More like the relief of knowing the ground is solid where you thought it might not be. Garrett and my daughter have been married almost 2 years now. They live in a semi in the East End. She's talking about opening her own practice. He coaches community hockey on Saturday mornings because he says it keeps him humble, which made me like him considerably more. Vivienne comes to birthdays. She came to the dinner we did for my daughter's 32nd birthday last April, sat at my kitchen table, ate the butter chicken I'd made, said it was the best she'd had outside of a restaurant. I can't tell you we're friends. I can't even tell you we're close. But there is something now that functions like respect, and that is more than I expected from her, honestly. I think about that rehearsal dinner sometimes, about the 90 seconds where I sat with the heat in my chest and decided. I didn't do what I did because I'm brave. I want to be honest about that. I did it because I was 63 years old and I had already spent 30 years in rooms where I swallowed things that deserved to be said, and I had run out of reasons to keep doing it. There comes a point, if you're lucky enough to get there, where the cost of staying quiet is simply higher than the cost of speaking. That's not courage. That's arithmetic. My daughter is happy. Her husband is good to her. I have a photo from the wedding on my fridge, the two of them laughing at something I can't see, out of frame, that pure, unguarded laugh you can't plan or pose for. Every October when the maple in the backyard goes gold and grief-colored, I stand at the kitchen window and I think, Some things end well. If you're paying attention and you're willing to say the thing out loud, the truth doesn't take care of itself, but it's there, waiting if you decide to pick it up. I've been thinking about what I actually did that night. Not the version where I'm brave, but the real one. I sat at the far end of a table in a restaurant where the bread cost more than my first week of groceries after her father left, and I listened to a woman reduce my daughter's entire life to a before and after story. And for about 90 seconds, I considered staying quiet. Because that's what you learn over 63 years of being in rooms where you're the least impressive person by someone else's measure. You learn to fold it down small and tuck it somewhere it won't show. But here's what I've come to understand, and it took me most of my adult life to understand it properly. Silence isn't neutral. Silence isn't neutral, and it has consequences the same as any other choice. When Vivian stood up and arranged those words about Miriam's modest background and her need for a different kind of life, she was counting on the silence of everyone in that room. That's how it works. That's always how it works. The small cruelties that get repeated at every family dinner for the next 20 years, they survive because the first time they happen, everyone is too polite, too uncomfortable, too afraid of making a scene to say, "No, actually, that's not right. I wasn't being noble when I stood up." I want to be clear about that. I was being practical. I had done the arithmetic, the way you eventually learn to do when you've lived long enough to see how things compound. Every time I'd swallowed something in that room over the previous 8 months, it had cost me something in a story. And it had cost Miriam something too, though she never said so. Things don't get better when you absorb them quietly. They just move underground where they keep growing. What I did was not complicated. I told the truth about my daughter. I said the things that were simply factually true, that she had built her own life from the ground up, that she didn't need anyone's pity dressed up as praise, that the people who loved her saw her clearly and didn't require her to be a redemption story. Those weren't brave words. They were just accurate ones that someone had been withholding. And then later, when I learned what Miriam had overheard on that deck, I made a phone call. That was also not complicated. I had information. I had a contact who already knew part of the story. I had a daughter who was 22 hours from her wedding and deserved to walk down that aisle without carrying the weight of Vivian's contempt on her back. So I made the call. I told the truth again, to a different person this time. That's the whole of it. I think about Vivian sometimes, about who she was before she became someone who says those things at rehearsal dinners. She wasn't born with that instinct to rank people by their postal code or their parents. That's learned. That's a long accumulation of choices, small ones, mostly, about who counts and who doesn't. Choices she probably stopped noticing she was making, and the consequences of those choices accumulated too, quietly, until one evening a woman in a Reitman's dress stood up at the end of her carefully arranged table, and the whole thing shifted. What I want Miriam to carry forward isn't anything I said in that restaurant. It's the understanding that the most important thing you can pass on to someone you love is the example of what it looks like to act with integrity when it costs you something. Miriam watched me stay quiet for 8 months because I thought it was the right thing for her. She watched me decide finally that speaking was the right thing for her. I hope she noticed both parts. I hope when her own moment comes, and it will come in some form because that's just the nature of a life lived honestly among other people, she remembers that the choice exists, that you don't have to absorb what isn't yours to carry. The truth doesn't take care of itself, but it's patient. And it's always there when you decide to pick it up.